The sun had barely begun to rise over the rolling hills of rural Texas, casting a soft golden light over the ranch. Birds chirped quietly, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. On this peaceful morning, the ranch looked like a scene from a postcard, calm and undisturbed. A few cattle wandered lazily across the fields, and the scent of fresh hay mingled with the crisp morning air. At the heart of it all, moving gracefully among the animals, was Marlene Thompson, a woman who seemed ordinary at first glance. She was elderly, her hair silver and pulled back into a neat bun, her face lined with gentle wrinkles that spoke of a life full of experience. To anyone passing by, she would appear to be just another grandmotherly figure. Living quietly in her secluded home, Marlene had spent most of her life in this rural town, tending to her land and caring for her animals. She was known in the community as kind and approachable, always ready with a smile or a helping hand. Children waved at her as they walked past her property on their way to school, and neighbors occasionally stopped by to share news or borrow some fresh eggs or vegetables from her garden. She had a routine, a rhythm to her days that made life predictable and serene. She would wake before dawn, feed her animals, check on the fences, and make sure everything was in order before settling down with a cup of coffee to watch the sunrise. But beneath this calm exterior, Marlene carried a past that very few people knew. For decades, long before she had settled on this ranch, she had served in one of the most elite units of the Special Forces. She had been a sniper, trained to operate in hostile environments with precision, patience, and unwavering focus. Her missions had taken her to dangerous places around the world, where every decision could mean life or death. She had been respected, feared, and admired by her peers for her skills and her calm under pressure. Those days were behind her now, and she had chosen this quiet life deliberately, wanting peace after years of chaos and danger. Yet, despite her retirement, the instincts and abilities she had honed in the military remained sharp. Embedded deep within her mind and body, that morning, Marlene moved around the ranch with her usual grace. She checked on the horses first, patting their sleek coats and speaking to them softly as they nuzzled her hands. Then she made her way to the chicken coop, counting the hens and making sure their eggs were safe. Everything seemed normal, but Marlene's eyes, trained over years of vigilance, scanned the surroundings with a careful awareness. There was nothing unusual, just the soft rustle of the wind and the distant call of a hawk. But she had learned long ago that peace could be deceptive. Danger often arrived silently when least expected. Several miles away, beyond the hills and through the narrow, winding roads, a different kind of presence stirred. A small group of men associated with a cartel had been moving through the countryside for days, looking for opportunities. They were ruthless, accustomed to intimidation and violence, and they believed they had spotted a potential target. Rumors had reached them about a ranch in this area, one that was supposedly involved in smuggling activities. Whether these rumors were true or not, they didn't care. They saw a chance to expand their influence and decided to act. They were confident, armed, and expecting little resistance. They had no idea who or what they would encounter. As the cartel members drove closer to Marlene's ranch, she was already outside, tending to her small vegetable garden. She was kneeling in the soil, pulling out weeds and humming quietly to herself. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, and her mind wandered briefly over memories of her younger days, missions completed, dangers faced, and comrades lost. She had seen the worst of humanity and survived, and yet here she was, seeking solace in the simplicity of planting carrots and watering tomatoes. She felt a sense of satisfaction in these small, quiet acts, a reminder that life could be gentle and rewarding if given the chance. Suddenly, something caught her attention, a faint sound in the distance too subtle for most people to notice. A low hum, the quiet crunch of tires on gravel. Her hand paused mid-motion and her senses sharpened. She rose slowly, standing tall and still, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the horizon. She saw the faint outline of vehicles approaching, moving with an unusual caution. Marlene's heart rate remained steady, but her mind clicked into action. She recognized patterns of movement from decades of training, the way people approached when they were confident yet cautious, trying to avoid drawing attention. These were not ordinary travelers. The cartel men had no idea they were being observed. They moved slowly, making sure their approach was silent, thinking that the ranch was unguarded. They laughed quietly among themselves, exchanging comments about how easy the job would be. They had expected an empty property or at most a few frightened animals and perhaps a defenseless elderly woman. They were completely unaware of the storm that lay ahead. Marlene returned to her house, but not out of fear. She walked with deliberate calm, her mind already assessing the situation. She knew she had time. She had a vantage point from which she could observe the entire property, a place she had prepared long ago when she had first moved to the ranch. It was a small, hidden nook behind the barn, partially concealed by trees and old wooden crates. From there, she could see every movement across the yard and beyond, while remaining completely hidden herself. As she positioned herself, Marlene took a deep breath, letting her muscles relax while her mind remained alert. She checked her tools, not weapons in the conventional sense, but equipment she had kept for emergencies. Even in retirement, she valued preparedness. Years of training had taught her that calm observation and patient strategy were often more powerful than brute force. She settled into her hiding spot, her sharp eyes following every movement on the property. The sun had climbed slightly higher, casting long shadows across the ground, making it easier to spot anything that moved against the light. The cartel vehicles continued to advance, unaware of Marlene's presence. They slowed as they reached the edge of the property, scanning the surroundings as if expecting something unusual. Their leader, a tall man with a scarred face, waved his hand dismissively. "It's empty," he muttered, a hint of arrogance in his tone. "Let's check inside and make sure there's nothing valuable." The men climbed out quietly, their boots crunching against the gravel, and moved toward the barn and house. Marlene remained perfectly still, her breathing steady, her mind calculating. She remembered the drills, the scenarios, the countless simulations she had run over the years. She knew how fear could cloud judgment, how overconfidence could be fatal. These men were walking into a situation they could not possibly understand, and she, with decades of skill, patience, and precision, was ready to respond if necessary. Yet at the same time, she felt a pang of sorrow. She did not wish harm upon anyone if it could be avoided. She had spent her life in conflict, and she had learned the cost of violence firsthand. She hoped that they would leave without incident, but she was prepared for whatever might come. Her past was a tool, a shield, and a weapon, but her present was still rooted in a desire for peace. She wished only to protect her home, her animals, and the quiet life she had worked so hard to build. The morning continued with an eerie calm. The animals stirred nervously, sensing the presence of intruders, but they did not panic. Marlene's gaze remained fixed, her mind analyzing each movement, predicting their next steps. Every instinct, every memory of her past missions was alive within her. She remembered the importance of patience, of choosing the right moment, of using strategy rather than haste. Time seemed to stretch, every second filled with silent anticipation. By the time the sun was fully up, the cartel men had moved closer to the house, still oblivious to the fact that they were being watched by someone far more capable than they could imagine. Marlene knew the moment of decision would soon arrive. She could feel it in the subtle shifts of the wind, in the way the men moved with false confidence, and in the quiet tension that hung over her beloved ranch. It was a moment that could change everything, and she was ready to face it with the same calm and precision that had carried her through decades of danger. And so, as the peaceful morning continued, the stage was set. The ranch, bathed in sunlight and quiet beauty, held within it a secret that no one outside could fathom. Marlene Thompson, an elderly woman who appeared gentle and unassuming, was more than meets the eye. Beneath her calm exterior lay a lifetime of skill, courage, and lethal expertise, all ready to protect the home she loved. The calm before the storm was over, and soon, the tranquility of the ranch would be tested in a way that no one could have predicted. The sun had climbed higher, casting sharper shadows over the ranch, but Marlene remained hidden, her eyes never leaving the approaching figures. The cartel members were moving closer now, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel drive. But they still didn't notice the quiet presence watching T. Hem from the edge of the barn, Marlene's heart remained calm, but her senses were alert in a way that only years of training could allow. Every sound, every movement, every subtle shift in the air carried meaning. She could tell how many were outside, their positions, the weapons they carried, even their level of caution. The men had split into two groups. One stayed near the vehicles, checking them as if to ensure nothing inside had been left behind. The others cautiously approached the barn and the main house, They spoke in low voices, trying to suppress any noise, but there was a nervous edge in their tone that betrayed their growing unease. They assumed the place was empty, but Marlene had seen enough people in situations like this to know that arrogance could be dangerous. She crouched slightly, her body pressed against the wooden wall of the barn, and assessed her options. She didn't want this to turn violent if it didn't have to, but she was ready. Years in special forces had taught her that hesitation in a dangerous situation could be fatal, both for her and anyone else in her care. She remembered past missions where she had to wait for the exact right moment to act. Patience was as much a weapon as any rifle, and she had mastered it long ago. The men moved closer to the house, their eyes scanning the windows and doors. One of them gestured toward the back door, nodding to another, and they quietly crept toward it. Marlene held her breath, though she was not afraid. Fear was something she had learned to manage, to control, to turn into focus. She watched as they tried the door handle, expecting it to give way, expecting no resistance, but the door didn't budge. "Locked," muttered one of the men, shaking his head. "Probably some old lady hiding inside." There was a hint of laughter in his voice, but it was strained. The others exchanged glances, unsure of what to do next. They were confident in their abilities, but the situation was not unfolding exactly as they had imagined. Marlene could hear their footsteps shifting, the small clinks of their weapons adjusting. Their nerves were starting to show. She stayed perfectly still, her breathing slow and steady. From her vantage point, she could see every detail of their movements, every subtle sign of hesitation. She noted the angle of their approach, the distances between them, the rhythm of their steps. She thought of her training, of all the times she had prepared for moments like this, and she felt the familiar rush of focus that always came before action. This was her domain, and she knew it better than anyone. Suddenly, one of the men kicked a small rock, sending it skittering across the gravel. The sound was tiny, but it echoed in the quiet morning. Marlene's eyes snapped to him immediately. He froze for a moment, sensing the possibility of being watched, but he didn't see anything. The other men laughed nervously, brushing it off. It was a small sound, but in that instant, Marlene knew the moment of confrontation was approaching. She decided to let them get closer. There was no need to rush. The best advantage she had was surprise. She could wait until they were fully exposed, until they were confident that nothing would go wrong, and then she could take control. Every step they took toward the house, toward the barn, was a step deeper into territory they didn't understand. They were moving like predators who thought they had cornered prey, unaware that the prey had teeth sharper than they could imagine. The men reached the porch of the house. One of them peeked through the window, trying to see if anyone was inside. Marlene could see his eyes scanning, his fingers tightening on the handle of his weapon. He had no idea how wrong he was about what awaited him. The other man stayed near the edge of the porch, covering his comrade, unaware of the full scope of the house and the surrounding area. They thought they had the advantage because of their numbers, but Marlene knew numbers alone were meaningless without skill, patience, and strategy. A slight rustling in the bushes to the side caught the attention of one of the men. He spun toward it, raising his weapon slightly. Marlene remained perfectly still, her body blending seamlessly into the shadows. She had always been able to disappear when necessary, to make herself invisible in plain sight. The men's attention wavered for a moment, and that moment could have been fatal if she had chosen to strike. Instead, she waited. She wanted them to relax, to believe they had time to make decisions. She remembered a principle from her military days. The longer they felt safe, the more mistakes they would make. Every pause, every gesture, every casual laugh they offered was a step closer to their undoing. She had spent years studying human behavior, anticipating movements and calculating outcomes. This was no different, even though the stakes were now personal rather than strategic. The men began to split up again, one moving around the side of the house while the other remained at the porch. Marlene noted their positions carefully. She considered every possible reaction, every potential escape route, every contingency. She had been trained for chaos, for unpredictability, and she understood that calm observation was the key to controlling it. Her eyes followed their movements, and she could almost feel the tension building in the space around them. Time seemed to stretch. The sun climbed higher, but the men were oblivious to the fact that someone was watching them, analyzing them, waiting for the perfect moment. They moved with caution, yes, but they were still confident. They still believed the house was empty. They still underestimated the woman who had lived quietly here for so many years. Marlene's mind wandered briefly to her animals. The horses in the barn were calm but alert, their ears twitching as they picked up on the unusual sounds. The dogs in the yard barked softly, sensing the intruders, but they too seemed aware that Marlene was in control. She felt a protective surge, a need to ensure that everything she cared for remained safe. Her life had been full of missions where she protected people who depended on her, and in some ways this was no different. One of the men at the porch tried the door again, testing its strength. It held firm. He frowned, muttering something under his breath. The other man, moving around the side, was scanning for windows for any sign of entry. Marlene watched every movement, noting the angles, the distances, the time it would take for them to cross open ground. She didn't need to rush. She had all the time she needed. Her thoughts turned to the cartel's mistakes. They were relying on intimidation and fear, assuming that any civilian would be too weak or too scared to fight back. They had no idea that their assumptions could not be more wrong. Marlene had faced enemies far more dangerous than these men, and she had survived every encounter because she relied on skill, preparation, and calm judgment rather than brute force or reckless action. She adjusted her position slightly, making sure she had a clear line of sight to the entire area. Her hands moved instinctively, checking her equipment, reviewing her plan in her mind. Everything was ready. She could act at any moment, but she chose to remain patient. Patience was her greatest advantage. The men thought they controlled the situation, but in reality, the control was hers. Every movement they made was observed, analyzed, and anticipated. The man at the side of the house paused, his eyes narrowing as he tried to spot any sign of movement. He muttered something in frustration, shaking his head. Marlene held her breath, staying completely still, her presence undetectable. She thought of her younger self during missions where a single misstep could cost lives. She had learned to move silently, to observe quietly, and to wait until the perfect moment arrived. That training was alive in her now, guiding every thought, every breath, every heartbeat. The man on the porch finally gave up on trying the door. He waved to the other man, signaling that they should regroup. Marlene watched as they moved back toward the edge of the yard, unconsciously giving her the opening she had anticipated. Their confidence had wavered slightly, and that was all she needed. She could feel the tension in the air, the way it thickened with every passing second. As they began to reassess their approach, Marlene knew the next moments would define what happened on her ranch. She remained calm, steady, and patient. She had the experience, the skill, and the presence of mind to handle what was coming. She had survived dangerous situations before, and she would survive this. The men were still unaware of the storm that waited for them in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to remind them that appearances could be deceiving. And so the ranch held its quiet tension, the sun shining down on a landscape that seemed peaceful, but was charged with anticipation. Marlene's mind ran through her plan one last time, every possibility accounted for, every angle covered. The cartel men thought they were in control, but the reality was far different. A battle of wits, skill, and precision was about to unfold, and the outcome would be decided not by numbers or weapons alone, but by patience, strategy, and a lifetime of training that no one would see coming. The morning sun climbed higher, and ranch seemed to hold its breath. Marlene stayed in her concealed position behind the barn, her body tense but perfectly still. The cartel men had moved around the house, regrouping as if trying to decide what to do next. They still believed they were in control, that the ranch was unguarded, and that the woman who lived here was nothing more than a frail old lady. They could not have been more wrong. Marlene's mind moved quickly, analyzing their positions and movements. Every instinct, every memory from decades of Special Forces missions guided her. She knew exactly how to exploit their mistakes. The men had split their focus, leaving gaps between them. One was at the edge of the yard, peering toward the barn, while the other lingered near the porch, glancing at the windows and doors. They assumed safety in numbers, but she knew that numbers meant nothing when the person they underestimated was trained, precise, and patient. The first sound that broke the morning calm was a soft step on the gravel, closer to the side entrance. One of the men moved cautiously, trying to get closer to the house. He was careful, but not careful enough. Marlene's eyes followed his every move. Her fingers rested lightly on the surface of the old rifle she had kept tucked away in her barn. a relic of her past but still deadly in her hands. She did not move yet. Patience was key. She had spent years waiting for the exact right moment, and she knew that moment would come. The man reached the corner of the house and paused. He glanced around nervously, muttering something under his breath to his partner. Marlene watched him carefully, noting the way he shifted his weight, the way his fingers tensed on the grip of his weapon. Every detail mattered. She had learned to read people like open books, to anticipate their actions before they even made them. This was no different from the missions she had undertaken in faraway countries, where a single miscalculation could cost lives. Then it happened. A sharp whistle of air, the faintest sound, and one of the men froze. He turned, confused, trying to locate the source. Marlene had moved silently to a slightly better position, giving her a clearer line of sight. She didn't panic. Her breathing remained steady, her mind focused. The men were still unaware of the storm that was about to descend on them. Another step, another noise, and she realized they were about to cross an open space near the barn. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She steadied her hands, controlled her breathing, and made sure everything was aligned. Years of experience had taught her that the first strike needed to be precise and decisive. She could not afford hesitation. One careful action, and the situation would shift completely. Suddenly, a loud clang echoed across the yard as one of the men kicked a metal bucket, not noticing it in the shadows. The sound startled him, but it also gave Marlene the opening she needed. She acted swiftly, her movements fluid and calculated. The man looked around in panic, realizing too late that he had walked straight into a position he could not escape. The shock in his eyes was clear. Marlene's actions were not violent for violence's sake. They were defensive, protective, and precise. Every move was designed to control the situation and minimize risk to herself while ensuring that the intruders could not harm her or her animals. She relied on technique, not brute strength, and every motion was the result of years of careful training. She had learned to be efficient, calm, and deadly without losing focus. The other man, sensing something was wrong, raised his weapon, but Marlene anticipated it. She had positioned herself to cover multiple angles, and her observation allowed her to track both intruders simultaneously. Every movement they made was being watched, calculated, and countered before it could become a threat. It was a delicate dance, one she had practiced countless times in her life, and now the stakes were personal. The yard seemed to stretch endlessly as the tension mounted. The intruders realized they were no longer in control. Confusion spread among them as they noticed the subtle signs, the way shadows moved unnaturally, the silence that seemed heavier than it should be, the sense of being watched from places they could not see. They had assumed an old woman would be defenseless, but the truth was far from that assumption. Marlene took a moment to assess the situation again. The man near the porch was trying to find cover, glancing toward the barn as if sensing something was amiss. She noted his path and calculated how long it would take him to reach safety, how he would move, and how she could maintain control without unnecessary risk. Every calculation was instantaneous, a mix of instinct and experience. Her years as a sniper had honed her ability to anticipate movements in fractions of a second, and that skill was now invaluable. The first man attempted to retreat, realizing that they had underestimated their target. He took a cautious step back, but Marlene was ready. She moved with quiet efficiency, positioning herself so that he had no escape route. Her presence was invisible to him, but the control was absolute. He had entered her domain uninvited, and now he would experience the consequences of that miscalculation. Marlene's focus never wavered. She had spent years learning to control fear, to use adrenaline as a tool rather than an obstacle. Her eyes scanned continuously, tracking both intruders, predicting their decisions, and ensuring that nothing unexpected could catch her off guard. She was calm, composed, and fully in command of the situation. Her training had made her patient, her instincts sharp, and her reactions precise. As the men moved, panic slowly began to replace their initial confidence. The one near the barn tried to shout a warning, but the sound was cut short by the sudden realization that they were completely outmatched. The situation unfolded faster than they could process. Every move they attempted to regain control only exposed them further, making their mistake increasingly apparent. Marlene had turned the element of surprise into a strategic advantage, and now the balance had shifted entirely. Her eyes flicked to the surrounding area, checking the positions of the animals and any obstacles that could be used in case the situation escalated. The horses remained calm, sensing her control, while the dogs watched quietly, alert but not aggressive. Marlene had always understood that the environment was part of the strategy. She moved not only with skill but also in harmony with the surroundings, ensuring that nothing was left to chance. The man near the porch finally realized that he was trapped. He glanced around frantically, searching for an escape route, but there was none. The subtle signs of panic were clear. His breathing quickened, his posture stiffened, and his eyes darted from shadow to shadow. Marlene stayed still, letting him see nothing while controlling every aspect of the confrontation. She had learned that fear could be a tool when used correctly, and now it was working in her favor. Time seemed to stretch as the situation reached its peak tension. The intruder's confidence had been shattered, replaced by confusion and fear. They had underestimated their opponent completely, and now they were paying the price for that miscalculation. Marlene's experience allowed her to act decisively, ensuring that the situation could be resolved with precision rather than chaos. Every step she took was calculated, every decision deliberate. Suddenly, the first man froze completely, his eyes wide as he realized the full extent of his mistake. The second man near the porch raised his weapon again, trying to assert control, but his movements were clumsy, uncoordinated, and slow. Marlene had anticipated both actions and was ready to counter them immediately. She could feel the tension in the air, the way the morning seemed to hold its breath as the confrontation reached its critical point. She moved again, silently and efficiently, her presence unseen but her control absolute. The men could feel that something was wrong, that the situation had shifted, but they could not identify how or why. Their fear grew, and with it their mistakes multiplied. Marlene's patience and precision ensured that every potential threat was neutralized before it could escalate. In the span of moments, the power dynamic had completely reversed. The intruders who had entered the ranch with confidence and arrogance were now disoriented, unsure, and completely under her control. Marlene's training, her calm observation, and her years of experience had turned the situation from a potential threat into a controlled resolution. She had managed to create order from chaos without losing focus or putting herself at unnecessary risk. As the confrontation began to wind down, Marlene remained vigilant, ensuring that every movement was monitored, every possible escape accounted for, and every threat contained. The men were bewildered, no longer able to trust their instincts or their assumptions. They had underestimated the woman they had intended to intimidate, and that miscalculation had brought them to the edge of defeat before any physical confrontation had fully erupted. By the time the sun reached its peak, the yard was quiet again, but the tension lingered. The intruders had been humbled, confused, and entirely outmaneuvered by a woman they had believed to be defenseless. Marlene had remained calm, precise, and fully in control, demonstrating skills honed over decades in situations far more dangerous than this. The lesson was clear. Appearances could be deceiving, and underestimating experience and skill could be catastrophic. And so, as the morning continued, the ranch returned to a tense calm. The immediate threat had been managed, but Marlene knew the situation was not fully over. Her vigilance would not waver, her observation would not falter, and her presence would continue to ensure the safety of her home and her animals. She had proven that even in apparent weakness, there could be unmatched strength, and that patience, precision, and experience could overcome even the boldest of threats. The dust had barely settled when the first law enforcement vehicles appeared at the edge of the property. The local sheriff had received a call about suspicious activity near the ranch, and officers had responded quickly, unaware of the full scope of what had already occurred. The cartel men were still disoriented, their confidence shattered, and they were beginning to understand that the peaceful-looking ranch they had targeted was far from ordinary. Marlene remained in her hiding spot for a moment, watching as the officers approached. Her body relaxed slightly now that the immediate threat had been contained, but she remained vigilant. She knew the importance of staying aware until every detail was confirmed. Years of experience had taught her that danger could appear even after the main conflict seemed to end. She also knew that explaining what had happened would require clarity and composure. When the officers reached the ranch, they immediately noticed the tension in the air. The vehicles of the cartel were parked haphazardly, some still running, some abandoned, and the men themselves looked confused and wary. One officer stepped forward cautiously, calling out for identification and ordering everyone to stay where they were. The officers were trained for dangerous situations, but nothing could have fully prepared them for what they were about to discover. Marlene slowly stepped out from behind the barn, her movements calm and unhurried. The officers' eyes widened as they took in the sight of the elderly woman who had been quietly tending her ranch just moments before. She did not look like someone who could handle armed men, yet the aura of control and authority she radiated was undeniable. Her posture was straight, her gaze steady, and there was a quiet confidence in the way she held herself that told them she was not to be underestimated. "Ma'am," one officer called, his voice cautious but respectful. "Are you okay? What happened here?" Marlene nodded slightly, her expression calm. "I'm fine," she said simply. "They came onto my property uninvited. I had to make sure they couldn't harm anyone or anything here." Her voice was steady, controlled, and carried the weight of someone who spoke from experience. The officers glanced at each other, exchanging looks that said they were beginning to realize the truth. They approached the cartel men carefully, ensuring that the situation remained under control. The intruders were now subdued, some sitting on the ground, others leaning against vehicles, all trying to process what had just happened. The officers noticed the subtle signs of panic and confusion that lingered in their faces, the result of having completely misjudged the woman they had tried to intimidate. As the officers questioned the cartel men, neighbors began to gather at the edges of the property, drawn by the commotion. They had heard rumors of trouble, but nothing could have prepared them for the scene they were witnessing. Whispers spread quickly through the small crowd. An elderly woman had defended her ranch against armed men alone. People were amazed, incredulous, and curious all at once. Marlene's neighbors had always known her as a kind, quiet, and gentle presence in the community. She was someone who baked pies for neighbors, helped children learn to ride horses, and shared vegetables from her garden. The idea that she could single-handedly control a dangerous situation seemed impossible, yet the evidence was right in front of them. The cartel men were clearly shaken, and the ranch remained untouched. Marlene had proven herself beyond doubt. The sheriff, now closer to Marlene, spoke with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. "You handled this remarkably," he said. "I've never seen anything like it. Were you trained in—" He hesitated, unsure how to phrase it without overstepping. Marlene smiled faintly, the hint of a past life surfacing in her expression. "I had some training," she replied quietly. "Many years ago. I spent a long time in situations where this kind of thing mattered. I've learned to stay calm and make every move count." She didn't elaborate immediately, but her words carried weight. She had been trained to be precise, to be efficient, and to remain composed in the most dangerous situations. That training had kept her alive, and it had kept her ranch safe today. The sheriff nodded, impressed but careful not to pry further. "Well, ma'am, you certainly saved lives today and probably prevented a lot of trouble. We'll make sure this is properly documented. And the men, they're going to face consequences for what they tried to do." As the officers secured the cartel men and began collecting evidence, Marlene walked slowly toward her house. The neighbors followed at a respectful distance, their curiosity evident. They had long admired her for her kindness and resilience, but now they were beginning to see another side of her, a side shaped by discipline, courage, and a history that few could imagine. Children peeked from behind fences, wide-eyed as Marlene moved gracefully through the yard. She offered a gentle wave but kept her focus on the task at hand. She began checking on her animals, ensuring that none had been harmed during the confrontation. Her horses nickered softly as she approached, and the dogs wagged their tails cautiously, sensing the end of the immediate danger but aware that their protector remained vigilant. The community slowly began to grasp the magnitude of what had occurred. Stories would spread, details would be shared, and soon everyone would understand that Marlene was no ordinary resident. She was someone who had faced unimaginable dangers in her past and yet had chosen to live quietly, peacefully, and without drawing attention to herself. That choice made her actions today all the more remarkable. Law enforcement officers continued their work, taking statements, photographing evidence, and securing the area. Marlene assisted where necessary, calmly explaining what she had observed and how the intruders had moved. Her clarity and precision impressed the officers. It was clear that she had experience in high-stress situations, and that her knowledge was reliable and practical. As the morning wore on, the sheriff finally approached her again. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, can you tell me more about your training?" he said, trying to balance curiosity with respect. Marlene paused, looking around at the ranch she loved, at the animals she had worked so hard to protect, and at the officers who had come to ensure order. She thought briefly of her past, of the missions, the danger, and the discipline that had shaped her life. Then she spoke, her voice calm but firm. "I spent many years in the Special Forces. I was trained as a sniper, and I've been in situations far more dangerous than this. I've seen the world in ways most people can't imagine, and I've learned the importance of patience, observation, and precision. That training doesn't leave you. It stays with you even when you want peace." The sheriff nodded slowly, clearly impressed. "I see why you were able to handle this so effectively. You kept everyone safe and you did it without unnecessary risk. That's extraordinary." Word of the incident began to spread through the small town. Neighbors, friends, and even distant relatives heard about the elderly woman who had defended her ranch against armed intruders. The story quickly became part of the local lore, and people who had once seen Marlene as a gentle, quiet figure now saw her as someone remarkable, capable, and fearless. Her past, hidden for so long, was now revealed, and the community responded with admiration and awe. Marlene herself did not seek attention. She returned to her routines gradually, feeding the animals, tending to the garden, and checking the fences. She moved with the same calm precision as always, but there was a new awareness around her. People no longer saw her only as the sweet elderly woman next door. They saw someone with extraordinary skill, courage, and experience. And yet she did not let this recognition change her. She remained humble, focused on the simple joys of her daily life, and committed to keeping her home and community safe. The cartel men had been taken into custody by law enforcement, and the evidence clearly showed that they had been planning illegal activities. Thanks to Marlene's actions, no one had been seriously harmed, and the authorities now had a detailed account of the intruders' movements and intentions. Marlene's precision and vigilance had ensured that justice could follow, and that the ranch remained a place of safety and order. As evening approached, the ranch returned to a calm,